Chapter 5 Data Collection Techniques. The Questionnaire. The American Heritage Dictionary of the English language defines questionnaire as a form containing a set of questions, especially one addressed to a statistically significant number of subjects, as a way of gathering information from a survey. In determining the pre-questionnaire planning, there are steps to be considered. 1. Define the problem and purpose. 2. Consider previous, related research, the advance of experts, and so on. 3. Hypothesize a solution to the problem, or at least identify research questions, the answer to which will shed some light on the problem. 4. Identify the information needed to test the hypothesis. This step should include deciding which aspects of the problem will be considered and planning ahead to the presentation and analysis of the data. 5. Identify the potential respondents or subjects. 6. Select the best or most appropriate technique for collecting the necessary data. To some extent, research findings are affected by the nature of the data collection technique used. In fact, findings strongly affected by the technique can lose their validity. Consequently, a researcher may elect to use two or more techniques and methods to test hypotheses and or measure variables. This process often is referred to as triangulation. Burgess believed that triangulation implies the notion of 3 points of view within a triangle. Therefore, Gorman and Clayton suggest using the term mixed methods to allow the researcher to use a range of methods, data, investigators, and theories within any study. Questionnaire offers several important advantages over other techniques or instruments for collecting survey data. Among them are the following. 1. The questionnaire, especially the mail, email, and web-based questionnaire, tends to encourage frank answers. This is in large part because it is easier for the researcher to guarantee anonymity for the respondent when using a mail questionnaire. 2. The characteristics of the questionnaire that help to produce frank answers also eliminate interviewer bias. This is not to say that the questions could not be worded in a biased manner, but that there is no style of verbal presentation which can influence the response. 3. Another way of stating the second advantage is that the fixed format of the questionnaire tends to eliminate variation in the questioning process. 4. The manner in which a mail questionnaire is distributed and responded to also allows it to be completed within limits, at the leisure of the participants. This encourages well thought out, accurate answers. 5. Questionnaires can be constructed so that quantitative data are relatively easy to collect and analyze. 6. Questionnaires can facilitate the collection of large amounts of data in a relatively short period of time. 7. Last but not least, questionnaires are usually relatively inexpensive to administer. Questionnaires also have disadvantages. Consider the following. 1. Use of the mail questionnaire eliminates personal contact between the researcher and the respondent. However, this also can be seen as an advantage, for, as stated earlier, the absence of direct contact eliminates interviewer bias from the questioning process. 2. The mail questionnaire does not permit the respondent to qualify answers to ambiguous questions, or, at least, makes it more difficult. 3. Studies have shown that persons who are highly opinionated regarding the subject of a questionnaire are more likely than others to be motivated enough to complete and return it. This phenomenon tends to result in a biased sample or return, as the less opinionated members of the sample will be underrepresented and may well have certain characteristics in common. 4. Questionnaires may be more difficult for uneducated participants to complete, again possibly resulting in a biased return. The researcher can minimize this problem by keeping his or her audience in mind when developing the questionnaire and writing the questions. 5. In general, there simply seems to be a resistance to mail questionnaires. In the extreme case, this can result in some participants attempting to sabotage a survey by purposefully responding incorrectly to some questionnaire items. 6. Non-response rates are relatively high for mail, email, and web-based questionnaires, although web-based surveys often first use another survey method to recruit participants. Since survey respondents are usually female, more educated, and older than those who do not respond to surveys, non-responses reduce the sample size and may introduce sampling error by eliminating a subset of the population. 7. If the questionnaire is distributed electronically, it will reach only those who have access to and are comfortable using email and web technology. Constructing the questionnaire. Proper construction of the questionnaire is essential to its success. In general, the researcher must consider his or her information needs and the characteristics of the participants. In selecting or writing specific types of questions, the researcher must first consider what kind of data he or she needs. The major types of questions, according to the kind of information needed, include the following. 1. Factual questions. Questions used to ascertain such things as the respondent's age, gender, and so on. They are probably the most straightforward type of questionnaire item. 2. Opinion and attitude questions. Questions intended to determine a person's ideas, inclinations, prejudices, convictions, and so on. 3. Information questions. Questions designed to measure the respondent's knowledge about some topic. They typically require the greatest response time. 4. Self-perception questions. Questions quite similar to attitude questions, but restricted to one's opinions about himself or herself. 5. Standards of action questions. Questions used to determine how respondents would act in certain circumstances. 6. Questions about actual past or present behavior. Questions that potentially fall within some of the categories of questions already identified but tend to be narrower in that they focus on behavior. 7. Projective questions. Questions that allow respondents to answer questions indirectly by imposing their personal beliefs, attitudes, and so on onto others. There are two basic types of questions according to form, which is known as the open-ended questions and fixed response questions. So, the open-ended or unstructured questions, as the name indicates, are designed to permit free responses from participants rather than ones limited to specific alternatives. As an example of an ended question, what do you think about the library? On the other hand, we have the fixed response or structured questions, also known as closed questions. It limits the responses of the participant to stated alternatives. The possible responses may range from a simple yes or no to a checklist of possible replies, to a scale indicating various degrees of a particular response. As an example of a fixed response question is that, do you have a current library card? So, in selecting or designing questionnaire items, the researcher must consider the question format that will best obtain the information desired. The form of the question in turn determines the method of response. The researcher must decide which response format will be the. Having decided on the types of questions to be employed in terms of the information needed and the form of response desired, the researcher must next decide what specific questions to ask and consider their content and wording. First, the researcher shall first ask himself or herself whether a specific question is actually necessary or will be useful. Next, the researcher should ask himself or herself is whether the respondents can be expected to have the information needed to provide an answer. Perhaps a question needs to be more concrete, specific, or related to the respondent's personal experiences, and last, but not the least, the researcher should be satisfied that each question asks only one question. This is a common occurrence in questionnaires, and yet it does not receive the attention that it deserves. The way in which the contents of questionnaire items are worded can also affect their validity and reliability. It is, therefore, a good idea to avoid questions that tend to be misunderstood because of difficult or unclear wording. Such questions can result from the use of biased and emotionally laden terms. In general, it is also a good idea not to use slang, jargon, and technical terms. Questionnaire items should be impersonal, and the questions should not be biased response to later questions. Even the sequencing of questions can influence how they are answered. Changes in question order can produce context errors, resulting in substantial differences in responses to the same question. Due to the effects of context, it is important to maintain the same order of questions if a survey is being repeated in order to investigate trends. It is generally recommended that questions with the similar context be placed together. Before continuing with the outline of the procedures for developing a questionnaire, it may be worthwhile to consider some of the types of questionnaire error. Some of the more common types of error or bias, not all of which are limited to questionnaires, are the following. 1. Researcher bias. In essence, this bias results from the researchers unconsciously developing the questionnaire in a manner that will increase the likelihood of obtaining the desired results. 2. Sponsorship bias. This bias results from the researchers, hopefully unconscious, attempt to produce research results that will please the outside agency funding the research. 3. Imperfections of design. Weaknesses in the design of the questionnaire can result in biased or inaccurate responses. 4. Respondent interpretations. As implied earlier, varying interpretations of the facts and key terms by the respondents also can result in inaccurate answers. 5. Time lapse. It has been found that answers to the same question tend to vary over time even when not directly affected by the passage of time. 6. Circumstances. A variety of factors, such as carelessness and mood of the respondent, ambiguous questions, unthinking answers, and general resistance to questionnaires, can produce inaccurate responses. 7. Response bias. Error can result from the response rate being low, and thus the final sample ends up less representative than originally conceived. 8. Reactive insight. There is a growing concern that, as subjects participate in surveys over time, especially in surveys dealing with sensitive topics, they may begin to rethink their lives, attitudes, and so on. In preparing the first draft, the researcher must decide on the sequence of questions in the most logical arrangement. Next, in evaluating the questionnaire, it is important to get more experts' opinion of the questionnaire. Next, we have the pre-test, which referred as a pilot study. It gives the researcher the opportunity to identify questionnaire items. And lastly, we have the final editing. The questionnaire must undergo final editing before distribution. In most cases, a cover letter should accompany the questionnaire. The basic purpose of the cover letter is to explain briefly the purpose of the study and to stress the importance of each person's responding. There are 3 main methods of administering the survey questionnaire. The questionnaire can be self-administered, which means that the respondents are asked to complete the questionnaire themselves. Administered face-to-face.to respondents by researchers, or administered to respondents via the telephone by interviewers. The self-administered questionnaire can be mailed or electronically transmitted via email or the web. Mail questionnaire refers to the instrument of a self-administered survey that has been laid out and reproduced in a paper-based printed medium. Most researchers utilizing a mail or email or web-based questionnaire should expect to have to conduct 1 or more follow-up mailings in order to reach an adequate response rate. Next, we have the electronic questionnaire. An electronic questionnaire contains questions are in a software system. According to Baker, a web survey is typically a survey in which the questionnaire is formatted with HTML and stored on a web server. Respondents are invited to a URL and required to log in or authenticate in some way. Questions are presented via the respondent's web browser, and responses are examined by the survey software and stored on the web server. Berto states that there are 3 components to successful web surveys: a database, programming code, and interface. The interview. An interview is a structured conversation where one participant asks questions and the other provides answers. The basic steps in developing a standardized or structured interview are not that different from those for developing most other kinds of survey studies. One of the first steps must be development of the list of questions to be asked, or the interview schedule. An additional step in the development of the interview involves the training of interviewers. Even if one is working with experienced interviewers, they need to become familiar with the researcher's particular questions. The same interviewers should be involved in the pre-test as in the final interview. In conducting the personal interview, the interviewer should attempt to create a friendly, non-threatening atmosphere. Advantages of the interview. Interview is better at revealing information that is complex or emotionally laden. The use of visual aids can sometimes facilitate presenting and recording complicated information. The data gathered from internet interviews can be easily uploaded to data analysis software packages. Disadvantages of the interview. One of the main biases of the internet interviewing is the unrepresentativeness of the sample, since not everyone has access or uses to the internet. Rapport and interpersonal relationships are more difficult to develop in an online interview. The interview can be quite expensive in terms of travel and long-distance telephone costs. The focus group is a group interview designed to explore in depth the feelings and beliefs people hold and to learn how these feelings shape overt behavior. They are called focus groups because the discussions start out broadly and gradually narrow down to the focus of the research. Analysis and reporting of the focus group data. The information acquired from focus group interviews is generally used to help researchers understand perceptions and attitudes of the target population. Other advantages and disadvantages of the focus group interview. The main advantage of focus group interviews is the opportunity to observe a large amount of interactions on a topic in a limited period of time. Focus group interviews are quite susceptible to bias caused by the interview setting, the moderator, faulty questions, and an unrepresentative sample. Telephone interviews. An interview that being conducted over the telephone. Advantages of the telephone interview. 1. It tends to provide significant savings in actual time and cost in contrast to the personal interview. 2. It can be conducted more quickly after an event has occurred. 3. It is generally easier to supervise, train, and monitor the staff for a telephone interview than for a personal interview. 4. Telephone interviews lend themselves to a certain amount of computer assistance. Observations. Observe means to watch attentively in a specific or systematic manner. In an observational study, the current status of a phenomenon is determined not by asking but by observing. Observation is sometimes treated as a research method, sometimes as a data collection technique to be utilized with the research method. Scientific observation should be systematic, objective, and free from bias, quantitative whenever possible, and strong in usability, reliability, and validity. Advantages of observational research. 1. The use of observation makes it possible to record behavior as it occurs. 2. Observation allows one to compare what people actually did with what they said they did. 3. Observational techniques can identify behavior, actions, and so on that people may not think to report because they seem unimportant or irrelevant. 4. With observational techniques, a researcher can study subjects who are unable to give verbal reports. 5. The use of observation is generally independent of the subject's willingness to participate. Observational techniques do suffer from a few limitations. Some of the more important ones are as follows. 1. It is not always possible to anticipate a spontaneous event and thus be prepared to observe it. 2. The duration of an event affects the feasibility of observing it. 3. Some types of behavior are obviously too private or personal in nature to be observed. 4. It is generally somewhat more difficult to quantify observational data than other kinds. There are essentially two basic types of observation: structured and unstructured. First, the structured observation is a more formal technique. often used in quantitative studies in order to provide systematic description or to test causal hypotheses. It may be used in field studies or in laboratory-type settings, but it should focus on designated aspects of behavior. On the other hand, the unstructured observation is sometimes equated with participant observation, but its most important characteristic reflects the fact that the researcher does not have predetermined sets of categories of behavior to use. Usability testing is a form of human ethnographic observation, combined with ergonomics and cognitive psychology. Evaluating usability involves measuring the degree to which a user can successfully learn and use a system or service. As new technologies develop, usability testing will become more important to determine if users are able to navigate through the systems and utilize system functionalities. In conducting survey research, the researcher has several data collection techniques at his or her disposal. This chapter has emphasized three of the most commonly used techniques: the questionnaire, the interview, and observation. Questionnaires and interviews are frequently used for obtaining information about a person's perceptions, beliefs, attitudes, and so on. As the internet has become more widely available and popular, it is being utilized to distribute questionnaires and to conduct interviews. With the web survey, more attention has been focused on the role of the survey interviewer in an automated data collection environment. With these techniques, heavy reliance is placed on the respondent's report. Normally, the investigator has not observed the events in question. Observational methods are best suited for describing and understanding behavior as it occurs. They are less effective for gathering information about a person's perceptions, beliefs, attitudes, and so on. Finally, in selecting a specific technique or instrument, the researcher shall weigh the various pros and cons of each method. Submitted by Jemica E. Dela Cruz, Bliss 3A. Thank you for watching. God bless.